And we are live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live stream. We are going to be covering the first chapter of the Cold War era. This is chapter 21 of the entire compendium, called Containment, and it covers the years 1945 to 1961, which includes the Truman administration and the Eisenhower administration. And so this chapter, and this what you're seeing is our website. And so you can go to it at www.tarpeia.us. Tarpeia is spelled TARPEIA.us. We are an educational nonprofit called Amending America. And so if you want to consider donating to a charity, you can. We make educational content like this, which is what I'm showing you is our compendium, which is an online library of thousands of primary source documents in the format of an interactive timeline, which is what you see here. And so this chapter, chapter 21, will include two sections. The first section is called The Buck Stops Here, and it covers the Truman administration from 1945 to 1953. And then the second section is called New Look, which was the domestic platform for Eisenhower. A lot of people at this time liked to add new to everything, like New Deal, New Look, New Freedom, New Frontier, stuff like that. So they liked new a lot. So this is Eisenhower. This is the New Look, 1953 to 1961. And so I'm going to show you both these sections today. Let's begin with Truman's. So, in the aftermath of victory, the Truman administration confronted the task of shaping a post war order as the Nuremberg trials prosecuted Nazi leaders and exposed the moral reckoning left by total war. Relations with the Soviet Union rapidly deteriorated as competing visions of security and reconstruction hardened into the Cold War, marked by the Truman Doctrine's commitment to contain communism and the Marshall Plan's efforts to rebuild Western Europe through American economic power. The division of Germany and the Berlin airlift symbolized both the geopolitical stalemate and the willingness of the United States to sustain global commitments short of war. At the same time, the dawn of the nuclear age unleashed an arms race that redefined military strategy and existential risk. By the early 1950s, Cold War tensions erupted into open conflict in Korea, cementing a world divided between rival blocs and establishing containment as the central framework of American foreign policy. So the first event that we have on the timeline is MacArthur meeting with the Emperor of Japan, Hirohito. And then you have the Nuremberg trials from November 1945 to October 1946. So they last almost an entire year. And the Nuremberg trials prosecuted leading Nazi officials for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace following World War II. Held by an international military tribunal, the trials established precedent in international law by affirming that individuals, not just states, could be held accountable for such crimes. Now, there's a lot to say about international law, whether or not it's actually justified or legitimate as an institution. Well, like all political institutions, it's legitimate when it's actually enforced. So there's that. We look at global, international courts today, and a lot of them are illegitimate in the sense that they're not enforced at all. Whenever the court makes a decision and then nothing happens after that, or maybe the courts just ignore conflicts and crimes committed, the same exact crimes committed, but in different scenarios, then that delegitimizes the institution. So that's a whole other discussion that we can get into. I have Truman's 1946 State of the Union address that people can read. And he talks about the aftermath of the war and the what would lead into the start of the Cold War. You have the long telegram. The U.S. diplomat George Kennan sent the long telegram from Moscow analyzing Soviet motives and warning that the USSR was inherently expansionist and opposed to the West. His message became the foundation of America's containment policy, shaping Cold War strategy for decades. We have the famous speech by Winston Churchill called Sinews of Peace. That's what he called the speech. Most people remember it as the Iron Curtain speech, where he coins the phrase the Iron Curtain. So, Winston Churchill's Sinews of Peace speech, delivered at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, famously coined the term Iron Curtain to describe the division of Europe imposed by Soviet-controlled regimes in Eastern Europe. Speaking to an audience that included President Truman, American political leaders, and students, Churchill warned that the Soviet Union's expansionist policies threatened democracy and called for strong Anglo-American unity to counter totalitarianism. The speech sharply shaped American public and political perception of the USSR, fueling early Cold War anxieties and helping to justify U.S. policies of containment and support for Western European recovery. And so, what we're doing with a lot of these archival audio and video is uploading them to our website and our YouTube channel, and so you can actually listen to Churchill's speech and a bunch of other speeches that we've included. We have the Social Unity Party forms. The Socialist Unity Party of Germany, the SED, was formed in the Soviet-occupied zone when the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD, and the Social Democratic Party of Germany, SPD, were forcibly merged under Soviet pressure. The SED became the ruling party of East Germany, consolidating communist control and aligning the state with Soviet interests. We have Vinson swears in as Chief Justice, so this begins the Vinson Court of the Supreme Court of the United States. Let's see, you have the Philippine Independence Act. You have the Nuremberg executions, which happened on October 16th. There is a picture of Goring dead, so I probably shouldn't show it on YouTube. I'm going to skip that. But the Nuremberg executions happened on October 16th, 1946, and a number of Nazi leaders were executed that day. Goring, he's not executed. He actually commits suicide with a cyanide pill. You have the Bizone formed. This is the Anglo-American zones. This was shortly called Bizonia, which is a kind of stupid name. And so you have the British territory in the north, the American territory in the south, and it combines, while this territory, the French territory, will eventually combine with Bizonium to make West Germany. So West Germany is not a thing yet, but it's currently being formed. You have Truman's 1947 State of the Union address, where he talks about the ongoing conflict, early conflict in the Cold War. You have Everson v. Board of Education of Ewing, a Supreme Court decision. You have the Truman Doctrine, not to be confused with the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan or the Marshall Doctrine is not the same as the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine pledging U.S. support in Greece and Turkey to resist communist pressure. This marked the formal start of America's policy of containment, committing the U.S. to oppose Soviet expansion worldwide. So, the Truman Doctrine is military containment, containing the USSR. And you'll see the Marshall Plan, which is introduced by General Marshall. That's this guy right here in the middle. And this guy right here to the left is Oppenheimer. And so a lot of people, scientists, military leaders, politicians, after World War II will become very humanitarian and wanting to spread peace around the world. And so the Marshall Plan, which was introduced by Secretary of State George Marshall, proposed the European Recovery Program, offering massive U.S. financial aid to rebuild Europe, a war-torn Europe. Known as the Marshall Plan, it aimed to restore economic stability, prevent the spread of communism, and strengthen Western alliances. So, the Truman Doctrine is using military force to contain the Soviet Union. The Marshall Plan is to rebuild Western Europe with financial aid. And part of the negotiations of the Marshall Plan is the Paris Conference. So the 1947 Paris Conference for the Marshall Plan discussions, officially the Conference on European Economic Cooperation, the CEEC, gathered 16 Western European nations from July to September 1947 to collectively plan their post-war recovery, creating a joint request for U.S. aid, which led the official European Recovery Program, the ERP. Key outcomes included establishing the CEEC to draft reconstruction needs and a final report requesting over $20 billion in 1940s money, setting the stage for the Marshall Plan's implementation. So the Marshall Plan is the economic recovery, which is going to be organized by the European Recovery Program, while the Paris Conference is the European nations making a report to the United States on what they need for reconstruction, post-war reconstruction. And the National Security Act, passed July 26, 1947, reorganized the U.S. military and intelligence structure by creating the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, and the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. It marked a permanent shift toward a centralized national security state in response to Cold War threats. So things are becoming very interesting when it comes to spying and stuff like that. The CIA. Yeah, the Cominform founded. The Soviet Union established the Cominform, Communist Information Bureau. Again, very spy versus spy thing. You have the CIA being created, and now you have the Communist Information Bureau being created to coordinate and tighten control over communist parties across Europe. It served as a response to the Truman Doctrine, ensuring ideological conformity and loyalty to Moscow during the early Cold War. You have London Foreign Ministers Conference fails with no agreement. London Foreign Ministers Conference between US, UK, Soviet Union, and France collapsed without agreement on the future of Germany and Austria. The failure deepened East-West tensions, paving the way for Germany's division into separate states. After Truman's 1948 State of the Union address, the communist coup in Czechoslovakia. The Communist Party of Czechoslovakia seized complete control of the government in a coup d'etat, ousting non-communist leaders. The takeover solidified Soviet influence in Eastern Europe and marked Czechoslovakia's transition into a one-party communist state, heightening Cold War tensions, at least in Western Europe. You have the Brussels Pact, which united Belgium, France, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom in a mutual defense agreement against potential aggression, particularly from the Soviet Union. The pact laid the foundation for European collective security and later contributed to the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. You have the implementation of the Marshall Plan, with the Marshall Plan Act, or the Economic Cooperation Act of 1948, provided over $12 billion in U.S. aid to rebuild Western European economies devastated by World War II. The program promoted economic stability, strengthened political alliances, and helped prevent the spread of communism. The Organization of American States chartered, so it's like NATO but for the Americas, establishing a regional body to promote peace, democracy, and cooperation among the nations of the Western Hemisphere. The OAS aimed to resolve disputes peacefully, foster economic and social development, and strengthen collective security in the Americas. You have the Six Power Conference in June of 1948. This is held in London, and it brought together the United States, United Kingdom, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, to discuss post-war German reconstruction. The conference failed to achieve consensus with the Soviet Union, reinforcing the division of Germany and accelerating the onset of the Cold War. So you can see pretty much every single decision that the countries are making at this time is only going to contribute to the Cold War instead of de-escalating the Cold War. We have the Berlin airlift from June 1948 to May 1949. So the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin in an attempt to force the Allies out of the city. In response, the United States and its allies launched the Berlin airlift, supplying food, fuel, and essentials by air for nearly a year, successfully sustaining the city and defying the blockade. You have the Displaced Persons Act, allowing for the immigration of over 400,000 European refugees displaced by World War II. The law aimed to provide relief to survivors of Nazi persecution and war-torn Europe while bolstering the U.S. labor force. You have the Truman's acceptance speech in the 1948 DNC. You have the order from Truman to desegregate the military. This is the Executive Order 9981. You have the Tri-Zone formed. So the Bi-Zone, which is British and American, is now combining with the French zone, so it becomes the Tri-Zone, and that will become West Germany. The election of Truman, he beats Dewey and Strom-Thurmond, interestingly enough. Truman defeats Dewey on November 2nd, 1948. Here's a funny image. So newspapers had published or written Dewey defeats Truman just in case Dewey won, and Truman got his hands on one of the newspapers. So it's a funny image because Truman won. I have Truman's 1949 State of the Union address. His inaugural address. This is technically his first one, since he ran as vice president to FDR, and FDR died early in his fourth term. You have the original Comic-Con. This is the Soviet Comic-Con established. This is the Soviet Union established the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comic-Con, to coordinate economic development and trade among Eastern Bloc countries. The organization aimed to counter the influence of the U.S.-backed Marshall Plan and strengthen economic integration under Soviet control. And the Tri-Zone reorganized into the FRG, so Tri-Zone, which are the three zones of what would become Western Germany, merge. U.S., British, and French occupation zones, and was reorganized into the Federal Republic of Germany, the FRG, establishing a democratic West German state. This formal creation of West Germany solidified the division of Germany and intensified Cold War tensions with the Soviet backed East Germany. So, purple on this map is West Germany, and then this is East Germany, and then here's Berlin, which is completely in East Germany, but half of the city of Berlin is allied, belongs to Western powers. And so the airlift was to get supplies from the west to Berlin, and they couldn't use the roads because the roads were being blockaded. The USSR detonates their first atomic bomb on August 29th, 1949, codenamed RDS-1, ending the United States' monopoly on nuclear weapons. The test marked a pivotal escalation in the nuclear arms race, intensifying Cold War tensions and prompting the U.S. to accelerate its own weapons programs. The Communist People's Republic of China proclaimed. Mao Zedong proclaimed the founding of the People's Republic of China, marking the victory of the Communist Party in the Chinese Civil War. The announcement established a single-party communist state, ending decades of internal conflict and reshaping the geopolitical balance in Asia. The GDR formed in East Germany. The German Democratic Republic was officially established by the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany as a socialist state. The formation of the GDR formalized the division of Germany, aligning East Germany politically, economically, and militarily with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. You have Truman's 1950s State of the Union address. You have the NSC 68 finalized. U.S. National Security Council finalized NSC 68, a top secret policy document outlining a strategy to contain Soviet expansion globally. The report called for a massive buildup of American military and economic power, laying the foundation of Cold War defense policy and increased U.S. involvement in foreign conflicts. The Schuman Plan proposed by French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman and largely designed by Jean Monnet, called for pulling Western Europe's coal and steel production under a single supranational authority to prevent future war, especially between France and West Germany. Adopted by France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, and Netherlands, and Luxembourg, it was implemented through the Treaty of Paris, April 18th, 1951, creating the European Coal and Steel Community, the ECSC. Unlike contemporary military integration efforts, the plan succeeded and became the foundation of modern European integration, ultimately leading toward the European Union. North Korea invades South Korea, June 25th, 1950, and a couple days later, the U.S. joins the Korean conflict. The Defense Production Act passed during the Korean War. This law provided the president broad authority to direct domestic industrial production, allocate materials and facilities, requisition resources, stabilize prices and wages, support expansion of production capacity, and manage labor and credit to meet defense needs. Although on its face, an industrial mobilization statute, DPA, has become one of the most important peacetime/wartime transition tools, giving the president enduring power to mobilize the domestic economy into national security for emergency contexts. So, the granting the president wartime powers during this time, even though we're technically not at war, like the Senate has not actually declared war, is, to me, from my understanding of the Constitution, very unconstitutional, but Congress passed it. The Plevin Plan created on October 24th, 1950. The Plevin Plan, proposed by French Prime Minister René Plevin on October 24th, 1950, sought to create a supranational European army that would allow West German rearmament without restoring an independent German national military during the early Cold War. It envisioned integrating the forces of France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg at the unit level under a single European command, a concept later formalized in the European Defense Community, the EDC Treaty of 1952. Although the plan ultimately failed when France refused to ratify the EDC in 1954, it shaped the course of European integration by pushing Western defense toward NATO based rearmament and redirecting European unity efforts toward economic integration instead. Truman's 1951 State of the Union address. You have the 1951 Schuman Plan, the Treaty of Paris, Truman's 1952 State of the Union address. Stalin proposes a united and neutral Germany. European Defense Community, EDC Treaty. Youngstown Sheet and Tube Co. v. Sawyer, Supreme Court decision. Eisenhower's speech on his foreign policy goals. This is during the campaign cycle of 1952. The Secret Nixon Fund, New York Post on September 18th, 1952, with a front page story headlined Secret Nixon Fund, which detailed the existence of an $18,000 political expense fund maintained by wealthy backers to reimburse Nixon's campaign related costs and suggested impropriety. The story quickly picked up and amplified by other outlets and critics, putting pressure on the Eisenhower campaign and leading Nixon to deliver his nationally televised Checkers speech later that month to defend himself against the allegations. And we have the Checkers speech here as well, and you can listen to it. This address was given after press reports accused Nixon of maintaining a secret political expense fund backed by wealthy supporters. Nixon's message was a blunt, emotional defense of his integrity, laying out his personal finances in detail and insisting the fund was used only for legitimate campaign expenses. He famously told viewers the one gift he would not return, a cocker spaniel named Checkers, given to his daughters, humanizing himself and reframing the controversy as a matter of fairness rather than corruption. The speech worked spectacularly as public opinion swung sharply in Nixon's favor. The Republican RNC and Eisenhower retained him on the ticket, and it established a new model for direct televised appeals to the public as a way to bypass party elites and hostile press scrutiny. You have Eisenhower's famous "I Like Ike" campaign ad, which was actually animated by some people from Disney, although it wasn't Disney itself directly. You have the Ivy Mike nuclear test, and this was a staggering 10.4 megaton yield as the world's first full-scale thermonuclear explosion using liquid deuterium fuel. It marked the dawn of the hydrogen bomb era, intensifying the US-Soviet arms race and permanently altering Cold War strategy. So this is the Ivy Mike test. You have the election of Eisenhower. He beats Adlai Stevenson. You have Truman's 1953 State of the Union address. And then you have his farewell address. So Truman is the one who will make the farewell address a tradition. Before this, presidents didn't usually give a farewell address. Washington, Adams, and Andrew Jackson did, but all the other presidents up to Truman did not give a farewell address. So Truman starts up that tradition. Every president since Truman who survived their presidency, gave a farewell address. And this goes into the next section, section 2 of this chapter, called New Look, 1953 to 1961. And this will cover the Eisenhower administration. And so let me start by reading the description I wrote for this section. The Eisenhower administration governed during a period of uneasy stability, defined by containment abroad and mounting pressure. Excuse me, and mounting pressure for reform at home. As Cold War blocs hardened with the creation of the Warsaw Pact and the acceleration of the nuclear arms race, Eisenhower relied on deterrence, covert action, and the doctrine of massive retaliation to avoid direct war. The launch of Sputnik shocked the United States into the space race, leading to Explorer 1 and renewed emphasis on science, education, and national security. At home, the modern civil rights movement emerged as a decisive force, beginning with the Montgomery bus boycott, propelled by Brown v. Board of Education, and also the lynching of Emmett Till, tested by federal enforcement in Little Rock and institutionalized through the Civil Rights Act of 1957, even as grassroots activism surged with the Greensboro sit-ins. The era closed with diplomatic strain after the U-2 spy plane was shot down, collapsing the Paris summit and underscoring how technological rivalry and unresolved ideological conflict continued to shape the Cold War world. So we begin with Eisenhower's first inaugural address that he gave on January 20th, 1953. If Eisenhower's 1953 State of the Union address, Stalin dies in March of 1953, and Eisenhower will give a speech to the UN, which is called A Chance for Peace. Now that Stalin's dead, he wishes to open up better communications with the Soviet Union. However, unrest in the GDR, that's East Germany, suppressed by Soviet troops. And in the United States, you have Julius and Ethel Rosenberg executed. So both the Soviet Union and the United States are doing things that will anger the other country. Executed at Sing Sing prison after being convicted of conspiracy to commit espionage, accused of passing U.S. atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. During the early Cold War, their execution became one of the most controversial episodes of the era, symbolizing the intensity of the Cold War fear, anti-communism, and debates over due process, especially regarding Ethel Rosenberg's role. You have the end of the Korean conflict, at least when the United States left Korea. France rejects the EDC. Warren swears in as Chief Justice, so this begins the Warren Court, 1953, at the start of Eisenhower's administration. You have Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech given at the UN. Eisenhower's 1954 State of the Union address. You have the famous Castle Bravo nuclear test, a dry fuel thermonuclear bomb at Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands, producing an unexpected 15 megaton yield, more than double predictions. More than double the predictions. That's a typo. Its use of lithium-7 in the fuel mix made it the first practical hydrogen bomb. But the massive fallout that sickened Marshallese islanders and Japanese fishermen sparked global outrage, accelerating Cold War nuclear anxieties and fueling calls for test bans. I think it's this nuclear test that will inspire Godzilla in Japan. I'll have to double check that. So this Castle Bravo test is one of the largest nuclear detonations in history, especially by the United States. There will be another one, the Tsar Bomba, but that'll be later um, in the next chapter. The FCC, the ABC Supreme Court decision. There's a video by Mr. Beat, so check out his channel and his video. Subscribe if you like it. You have Bowling v. Sharp and Brown v. Board, two Supreme Court decisions that are decided on the same day, May 17th, 1954. For this decision, the Supreme Court ruled that separating children in public schools on the basis of race was unconstitutional. It signaled the end of legalized racial segregation in the schools of the United States, overruling the separate but equal principle set forth in the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case. Now, the Senate censors McCarthy. So this is the downfall of McCarthyism in 1954. Eisenhower's 1955 State of the Union Address. Williamson v. Lee Optical Supreme Court decision. FRG becomes a sovereign state and joins NATO. The Warsaw Pact in the Eastern Bloc. State Treaty of Austria. The lynching of Emmett Till in August of 1955. Emmett Till was an African-American boy who, at 14 years old, was abducted and lynched in Mississippi in 1955 after being accused of offending a white woman, Carolyn Bryant, in her family's grocery store. The brutality of his murder and the acquittal of his killers drew attention to the long history of violent persecution of African Americans in the United States. Just like the boring, or the Goring, just as the Goring image of his death, I also have the open casket of Emmett Till. I'm not going to show it on YouTube because I'm not sure how much YouTube would appreciate that. But we have that image on the timeline. You have the Holstein Doctrine, articulated by Walter Holstein, stating that West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, would sever diplomatic relations with any state except the USSR that formally recognized East Germany, asserting Bonn's claim that the sole legitimate German government. Bonn's claim to be the sole legitimate German government. The doctrine became a central tool of West German Cold War diplomacy, shaping its foreign relations until it was abandoned under the Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik in 1969. You have the Rosa Parks bus boycott, working with the Montgomery NAACP, deliberately refused to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama, as a planned illegal challenge to segregation laws designed to provoke public attention, and a test case that would reach the Supreme Court. Her arrest triggered the Montgomery bus boycott, organized by the NAACP and local black leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., while attorneys appealed in the case Browder v. Gale, which challenged bus segregation directly in federal court. On the 13th of November, 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the ruling that bus segregation was unconstitutional, and the boycott's success transformed the civil rights movement by demonstrating the power of mass nonviolent protest, legal strategy, and national mobilization. So it's interesting to note that Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott happened only a couple months after the lynching of Emmett Till, and it happens in the same state of Alabama. So I think that it's the lynching of Emmett Till that I would argue drives the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s rather than the Brown v. Board case, because Brown v. Board case is all the way over here, and nothing is done for over a year. But then, after the lynching of Emmett Till, now you have all these boycotts and demonstrations going on. So, I would argue that Emmett Till is the start of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, rather than the Supreme Court decision Brown v. Board. So you have the Montgomery bus boycott, which I talked a little bit about that in the Rosa Parks boycott. You have Eisenhower's 1956 State of the Union address. Khrushchev begins his de-Stalinization at the 20th Party Congress. We have the Southern Manifesto on Integration. The Southern Manifesto on Integration was drafted primarily by Senator Strom Thurmond and other Southern lawmakers, condemning the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, as a clear abuse of judicial power. Signed by 101 congressmen, it defended segregation under the guise of states' rights and became a cornerstone of the South's organized resistance to desegregation. You have the Nat King Cole assault. 4 members of the White Citizens Council, led by Edward R. Lambton, rushed the stage in an attempt to abduct Cole as a protest against racial integration. Cole was knocked from his piano bench and suffered a back injury. Police quickly subdued the attackers, who were arrested and later convicted. Although Cole finished the song he had been performing, he canceled the remainder of the concert and announced he would never perform in the segregated South again. The assault became one of the most infamous racially motivated attacks on a prominent entertainer during the early civil rights movement. The Hungarian uprising, where students and workers demanded political reform and an end to Soviet domination, briefly forcing Imre Nagy to form a reform government and announce Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. On November 4th, 1956, the Soviet Red Army invaded, crushed the revolt with overwhelming force, killed thousands, arrested Nagy, who would later be executed, and reaffirmed Soviet control, revealing the limits of reform within the Cold War Eastern Bloc. You have a pretty interesting debate between Eleanor and Margaret. This is a presidential debate. Of course, it's not the presidential candidates, but it's 2 women. One is the wife of a former U.S. president, and the other is a senator, Congress. One is Democrat, one is a Republican. And so this is the first debate, presidential debate, and it's interesting because it's between 2 women. So this is before the first actual presidential debate between Kennedy and Nixon in 1960. So it's pretty interesting. In the election of Eisenhower wins against Adlai Stevenson. Browder v. Gale ruled that racial segregation on public buses violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The court issued a summary affirmance without full opinion, effectively striking down Montgomery's bus segregation laws. Its mandate took effect on December 20th, 1956, ending the Montgomery bus boycott. Eisenhower's 1957 State of the Union address, his second inaugural address, and then the Treaty of Rome. On March 25th, 1957, a treaty by France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg established the European Economic Community, the EEC, and the European Atomic Energy Community, Euratom, It created a common market with free movement of goods, services, capital, and labor, and set up supranational institutions to oversee economic and policy cooperation. Entering into force on January 1st, 1958, the treaty laid the foundation for deeper European integration and ultimately for the creation of the European Union. You have Strom Thurmond's infamous filibuster. This was the longest um, filibuster in American history until just like a year ago, where you have another senator, a Democrat this time, who spoke for over 24 hours. So Strom Thurmond, senator from South Carolina, conducted the longest one-person filibuster in U.S. Senate history, speaking for 24 hours and 18 minutes in an attempt to block passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which aimed to protect black voting rights. Though he failed to prevent its passage, his obstruction highlighted Southern resistance to civil rights reforms and underscored the deep divisions in Congress over racial equality at the dawn of the civil rights movement. During this time, you have the Little Rock incident, which is actually multiple incidences. And so the first incident was on September 4th, where one of the Little Rock Nine students went early to the school, and she was kicked out by a mob of desegregationists, or I guess pro-segregationists, and that's where you get this famous photograph from. This is Elizabeth Eckford harassed by an anti-integrationist mob on September 4th, 1957. So this is the Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus uses the National Guard to block Little Rock 9 from entering Central High School. Elizabeth Eckford is confronted by a hostile mob after she alone tries to enter a school after miscommunication with the rest of the group. And so you see the National Guard back here. And I think Elizabeth Eckford is actually still alive. So this woman. So this is an ancient history. Like, a lot of these people are still alive who did this, who witnessed this, and participated in it. So, I mean, they're probably close to dying, but still. You have the Civil Rights Act of 1957, passed on September 9th, 1957. This was the first federal civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, creating the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department and a Federal Civil Rights Commission to investigate voting discrimination. Although its enforcement powers were limited by Southern opposition, it marked a critical first step in renewed federal involvement in civil rights and laid the groundwork for stronger legislation in the 1960s. You have the official Little Rock 9 incident. The Little Rock 9 attempt to once again enter Little Rock Central High School as a group this time. The Arkansas National Guard blocked their entrance as a large mob gathered to harass the students. So that is where this photograph is depicting. You have Eisenhower's address about the executive order that he signs about the Little Rock 9 incident, where he sends the 101st Airborne Division to escort the students to school. And it's during this time where you have Sputnik. So you have all these different things. So you have Strom Thurmond's filibuster, you have the Little Rock 9 incident, and you have the Civil Rights Act of 1957, and now you have Sputnik 1 being launched at this time. So the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite, shocking the United States by demonstrating Soviet advances in rocket technology. Its launch sparked fears of falling behind in science and defense, fueling Cold War anxieties, accelerating the space race, and leading to major U.S. investments in education, research, and the creation of NASA. Sputnik couldn't do much except repeat a beeping noise and its orbit would decay, leading to a crash on January 4th, 1958. So it only lasted a couple of months, and it didn't really do much of anything except make a beeping noise. And you'll see that this is kind of when people talk about how the Soviets were ahead. For all of these advancements, the Soviets were ahead by only a couple of months. And also, they rushed things. That's how they got ahead, because they rushed things. The first US satellite will be Explorer 1, and Explorer 1 actually did real science. Sputnik 1 didn't do any science, it just made a beeping noise. It didn't collect any more data than that. Explorer 1 did collect a lot of data. So, were the Soviets actually ahead? I would argue no. They were just rushing things, and they weren't getting much return out of what they were rushing. Another example would be Sputnik 2, which had a dog on it, which is Laika. And so, again, this did not really teach the Soviets all that much. It taught, I guess, the most important thing was that living creatures could be in a vessel in space. All right, congratulations. But again, the actual science done was mostly done by Explorer 1, the first US satellite into space. So I have Eisenhower's 1958 State of the Union address, which he talks about Sputnik. And then you have Explorer 1. It is the first artificial satellite developed by the Army Ballistic Missile Agency. NASA is not yet invented, or at least it will be established in a couple months after this. Under Werner von Braun, and carrying instruments that discovered the Van Allen radiation belts. The achievement restored American confidence after the shock of Sputnik, marking the nation's entry into the space race and demonstrating that the U.S. could compete technologically with the Soviet Union. So NASA will be established in order to manage the space program of the U.S. in the space race. You have a very important Supreme Court decision, Cooper v. Aaron, where the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the state officials could not refuse to comply with the court's desegregation orders established in Brown v. Board of Education. The court held that the Constitution and the Supreme Court's interpretations of it are binding on all states under the Supremacy Clause. The decision reaffirmed federal authority and strengthened the enforcement of school desegregation during the civil rights movement. At the start of the Second Berlin Crisis, the Khrushchev calls for peace. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev called for peaceful negotiations, arguing regarding Berlin, marking the beginning of the Second Berlin Crisis. The first one was the Berlin airlift, which arose from escalating tensions over the status of West Berlin and the flow of refugees from East to West Germany. The crisis intensified Cold War confrontations by highlighting the division of Germany, prompting the United States and its allies to reaffirm their commitment to West Berlin and setting the stage for future diplomatic and military standoffs. You have Khrushchev's Berlin Ultimatum, where Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev issued the Berlin Ultimatum, demanding that the Western Allies withdraw from West Berlin within 6 months and threatening to transfer control of access routes to the East Germans if they refused. The ultimatum aimed at pressuring the US, Britain, and France to reorganize East Germany and abandon their foothold in Berlin, was firmly rejected by America under Eisenhower, setting the stage for heightened Cold War tensions and later negotiations at Geneva and Vienna. You have the Alaska Constitution, which Alaska and Hawaii are being admitted into the Union in 1959. Eisenhower's 1959 State of the Union address, the admission of Hawaii, Khrushchev's tour in America, where he actually threw a tantrum because he wasn't able to go to Disney, which is funny. Eisenhower's 1960 State of the Union address. You have the Greensboro sit-ins. Four young African American men, freshmen at the Agricultural and Technical College of North Carolina, entered the Greensboro Woolworths and sat down on stools that had, until that moment, been occupied exclusively by white customers. The four, Franklin McCain, Ezell Blair Jr., Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond, asked to be served and were refused, but they did not get up and leave. Instead, they sat in the rest of the day peacefully and took up space that would have gone to paying customers. The next day, more than 20 black students joined. White customers harassed the black students, and the lunch counter staff continued to refuse them service. News reporters and TV cameramen covered the protests, sharing the protest with the rest of the nation. On the third day, more than 60 people came to the lunch counter. On the fourth day, more than 300 people took part in the protests, which now included nearby lunch counters. As the sit-ins took place in Greensboro, students from other North Carolina sites, including Winston-Salem, Durham, Raleigh, and Charlotte, staged similar protests. The sit-in movement spread to Nashville, Tennessee, Atlanta, Georgia, Richmond, Virginia. By early March, most lunch counters around Greensboro would be desegregated over the next few weeks. So these four men right here are the ones who did the Greensboro sit-ins. Kind of cool. You have the SNCC, the SNCC, founded, inspired by the Greensboro sit-ins. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, was founded and helped organize major and successful protests throughout the early to mid-1960s, including the Freedom Rides of 1961 and the 1963 March on Washington. JFK goes on Face the Nation. It's PBS, I think, during the campaign cycle of 1960. A U-2 spy plane is shot down by the USSR. And the Civil Rights Act of 1960. Eisenhower's remarks on the U-2 incident, which will ruin the Paris summit. And a video of Truman criticizing JFK, and then JFK responds to Truman's criticism. JFK's acceptance speech at the 1960 DNC. JFK will address the religion issue because he was a Catholic, and that was a major controversy for many Protestant voters. You have the infamous JFK versus Nixon debate, the first one. And so this is the first presidential debate that we all know and love. And so I have all of the presidential debates on the timelines here. So this is the second one, and then the third one. And then the fourth one. JFK goes back on Face the Nation. JFK's election eve speech. And then the election of Kennedy himself. Kennedy wins over Nixon. Nixon concedes at around 12:15 a.m., 3 a.m. EST. Nixon concedes to JFK. And I have a video of him conceding. I have JFK's victory speech. And then later, while he is still the president-elect, he gives a speech in the Massachusetts legislature called the City on a Hill speech, which references the Winthrop Voyage of 1630. Eisenhower's 1961 State of the Union address. He did not give this address in person. He gave it as a letter. Instead, he would give a farewell address. So you can listen and watch Eisenhower's farewell address as well on the timeline. And this will conclude right at the hour. This will conclude this live stream today, covering chapter 21. Tomorrow we'll cover chapter 22, which is called Détente. I'm going to go to it. So, Détente, which will include the years 1961 to 1977. And this includes the presidential administrations of JFK, of LBJ, Nixon, and Ford. So those 4 presidents in this 16-year period is what's going to be included in tomorrow's live stream. So I hope you learned something new about our old history. And just so you know, what I'm showing you is a website. It is our charity's website, www.tarpeia.us. Tarpeia is spelled TARPEIA.us. And this is chapter 21 of the Compendium. So if you go to the Compendium in the menu, go to Cold War era, Containment, 1945 to 1961 is what I just talked about today. So I hope you guys tune in to tomorrow's live stream. Feel free to ask questions in the comments, and I'll take a break to answer them. And just so you know, we are an educational nonprofit, a 501c3. All donations are tax deductible. If you want to contribute to our charity, we provide educational resources like the Compendium, and we are constantly updating it, adding more information, adding more primary source documents and events, fixing typos and whatnot. And so your contributions go a long way to maintaining our programs like the Compendium. So thank you for watching this live stream. Again, I hope you join me tomorrow, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. All right, bye-bye.